A seriously ill patient is left without help and dies, but her father is a judge who has no intention of forgiving such negligence. The perpetrators don't yet know what awaits them. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. Ariana Jones began her morning like any other, routine, yet marked with purpose. She had just turned 22, a young black woman with a vision. Her life, filled with the typical challenges of a medical student, was often punctuated by the drive to help others, a dream instilled in her since childhood. Growing up in a close-knit family with her father, Judge George Jones, as a guide and example of justice and fairness, Ariana had long aspired to a career where she could make a difference. Ariana's room was filled with a warm, soft light as the sun spilled in through her window. She rolled out of bed, stretched, and made her way downstairs, where the rest of her family was already bustling about. Her mother, Denise, was making breakfast while her younger brother, Michael, fumbled with his school books at the table, grumbling about an upcoming test. Her father, George, was sipping coffee and reading the morning news, his ever-present look of calm composure contrasting with the mild chaos of the morning. "You're up early," Denise said with a smile as Ariana sat down, pouring herself a glass of orange juice. "Can't sleep in forever, Mom," Ariana laughed. She glanced at Michael, who muttered something about chemistry exams. She reached over, tousling his hair, much to his annoyance. "You know," George began, looking over the rim of his newspaper with a smile, "I'm proud of you, Ari. Not everyone has the courage to pursue medicine, especially with the drive you have to make things right." Ariana's face softened. "Thanks, Dad. I know it's tough, but I really want to be someone who makes a difference. There are just too many people out there who don't get the treatment they need, who feel ignored. I want to be someone who changes that." George nodded approvingly. To him, justice was a principle that extended beyond the courtroom. It was something he had instilled in his children. Ariana's commitment to fairness and compassion was, in his eyes, proof that she had learned this lesson well. It was during this morning of laughter and shared stories that Ariana first felt the pain. It started as a faint, uncomfortable twinge in her lower abdomen. At first, she dismissed it as nothing serious, perhaps something she'd eaten the night before, or the result of her hectic study schedule. As the hours passed, though, the pain grew sharper, intensifying with every movement. Still, she kept quiet about it, not wanting to worry her family or disrupt the flow of the morning. The family breakfast continued, and Ariana tried to mask her discomfort, though it became increasingly difficult. She found herself shifting in her seat, unable to ignore the persistent ache gnawing at her insides. Her face grew paler, and she reached for her glass of water, hoping it would ease the discomfort. George noticed her strained expression. "You all right, sweetheart?" he asked, concern evident in his eyes. Ariana forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Probably just a stomach cramp. It'll pass." But George's instincts as both a father and a judge kicked in. He could tell something was wrong, even if she was trying to brush it off. He watched her closely as she tried to go about her day, but with each passing moment, her discomfort became harder to hide. By midday, Ariana's condition had worsened. The pain was now a constant, throbbing presence in her abdomen, making her feel faint and nauseous. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to continue with her tasks, but the discomfort had grown unbearable. She was visibly struggling to keep up appearances, her face now pale and beads of sweat forming on her forehead. Denise noticed, her motherly intuition sensing something was very wrong. She approached Ariana, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Honey, You don't look well. Are you sure you're okay?" Ariana's attempt to reassure her mother faltered. She opened her mouth to say she was fine, but the words didn't come. Instead, she simply shook her head, her hand clutching her abdomen. Denise immediately called for George, her voice laced with worry. "We need to get her to the hospital," George said firmly, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a growing sense of urgency. Ariana protested weakly, not wanting to make a fuss, but George and Denise were resolute. They helped her into the car, George taking the wheel and glancing at Ariana in the rearview mirror with a mix of anxiety and determination. The hospital was bustling with people when they arrived. Patients waiting in chairs, nurses hurrying from one room to another, doctors conferring in low voices. George helped Ariana into the waiting area where they approached the front desk. A middle-aged woman with a weary expression was handling registrations, her gaze skimming the crowded room with practiced detachment. George stepped forward, explaining Ariana's symptoms and asking for immediate attention. The woman barely glanced up, her tone flat as she instructed them to wait. "We're very busy today, sir," she said briskly. "Have a seat, and someone will be with you shortly." George frowned, his frustration rising. "My daughter is in severe pain. Can't you see how pale she is? I think she needs urgent care." But his words were met with indifference. The receptionist only shrugged, nodding toward the chairs in the waiting area. "Take a seat, and we'll call her name when someone's available." Reluctantly, George led Ariana to the seating area, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He watched as people who appeared less ill than his daughter were taken in first, each patient called ahead of Ariana. The receptionist's indifferent tone and dismissive gestures began to gnaw at him, a quiet frustration building as he sat helplessly with his daughter. After what felt like an eternity, Ariana's name was finally called. A nurse named Mary Clayton appeared, her expression blank as she glanced at her chart, barely acknowledging Ariana and George as she led them down the hallway to an examination room. Mary Clayton was a tall woman with a stern face and an air of impatience. She didn't smile or offer any words of reassurance as Ariana struggled onto the examination table, clutching her abdomen. "Symptoms?" Mary asked, not looking up from the clipboard in her hand. Ariana tried to describe the pain, sharp, unrelenting, growing worse by the minute. But Mary's response was cold, her tone dismissive. "You're probably just dehydrated. Young people these days don't drink enough water. I'll get you some ibuprofen." George stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Can't you run some tests? My daughter's in serious pain, and she needs more than just ibuprofen." Mary shot him a look of mild irritation. "Sir, we see patients like her all the time. Minor discomforts that feel worse than they are. I'll have her blood pressure taken, but that's all that's necessary right now." The dismissiveness in her tone stung, and Ariana felt a pang of shame, as though she was being accused of exaggerating her pain. She wanted to protest, but the pain was too overwhelming, leaving her unable to find the words. As they waited in the examination room, George's anger grew. He had seen injustices before, but never had he felt so powerless. He sat by Ariana's side, holding her hand, trying to keep his voice steady as he reassured her. Yet, he couldn't ignore the dismissive attitude they had encountered, the way his daughter's pain was brushed aside as if it were insignificant. He kept glancing at the clock on the wall, each minute ticking by like an eternity. Ariana's breathing grew shallow, her face ashen, and George's heart raced with fear. He knew that something was deeply wrong, yet the people who were supposed to help her didn't seem to care. He resolved then and there that he would not let this go. Whatever happened, he would find a way to get his daughter the treatment she needed, and if they wouldn't listen to him here, he would make sure they paid attention somewhere else. Ariana's condition worsened as the hours passed, and the pain, once a dull ache, became a sharp, unbearable force that seemed to pulse through her entire body. Her skin grew clammy, beads of sweat forming along her brow as she struggled to keep her breathing steady. George watched in alarm, his eyes darting between his daughter and the door, hoping someone, anyone, would finally take notice and offer her the care she so desperately needed. Despite his growing frustration, George tried to comfort Ariana, holding her hand and murmuring reassurances. But even he could feel the weight of his own helplessness. He was accustomed to power, to making decisions that changed lives, to being the voice that mattered in a room. Here, though, he was just another worried father, and his voice seemed to hold no weight at all. By now, they had been waiting for hours. Each time a nurse or doctor passed by, George would catch their eye, hoping they might take a moment to assess Ariana's condition, but they either ignored his silent pleas or offered curt nods, saying that someone would be with them shortly. George clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. Ariana's face had turned ghostly pale, and she leaned against her father's shoulder, her eyelids fluttering as though the effort to stay awake was becoming too much. "Dad," she murmured weakly, "it hurts. So much." "I know, sweetheart," George replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know. Just hold on a little longer. They'll come soon. They have to." Ariana managed a faint smile, but even that seemed to drain her. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the wall, her breathing shallow. George could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his anxiety building as he watched his daughter, who only this morning had been so full of life and energy, now looking as though she might collapse at any moment. Finally, unable to contain his frustration any longer, George stood up and approached the front desk again. He demanded to see a doctor immediately, his tone no longer polite or patient. The receptionist, taken aback by his sudden intensity, assured him once again that they were doing their best and that Ariana's case was on the list. But to George, it was clear that they didn't see his daughter as a priority. She was just another name on a clipboard, another case that could be pushed aside. Returning to Ariana's side, George found himself torn between anger and despair. He couldn't understand why they were being treated this way, why his daughter's obvious pain was being dismissed so easily. He glanced around the waiting room, noticing that other patients, some of whom looked far less distressed than Ariana, were being attended to promptly. He couldn't help but feel a sense of injustice growing within him, a gnawing suspicion that their treatment here had more to do with prejudice than with any real shortage of resources. Ariana's grip on his hand tightened, pulling him from his thoughts. "Dad, I don't feel right. Something's really wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. George's heart sank. He had always prided himself on being able to protect his family, to keep them safe from harm. But here he was, powerless, watching his daughter suffer and unable to do anything to ease her pain. He leaned closer, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "I'm here, Ariana," he said softly. "I won't leave you. I'll make sure you get the help you need." But deep down, a terrible fear gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that every second they waited was another second Ariana was being pulled further away from him. Just then, Nurse Mary Clayton entered the room, her expression as detached as before. She barely glanced at George or Ariana, her focus entirely on the clipboard in her hand. "Let's get her vitals checked," she said, as though she were announcing a routine procedure rather than addressing a young woman in visible agony. George stood up, his posture tense. "It's been hours," he said, his voice low but filled with a barely restrained fury. "My daughter is in excruciating pain. Can't you see she needs more than a simple checkup?" Mary shot him a quick, dismissive look. "We're following protocol, sir. There are procedures in place, and we're handling her case according to those guidelines." George felt his anger flare, but he held back. This was not the time to lose control. Ariana needed him to be calm, to keep pushing for her, no matter how infuriating the system seemed. He watched as Mary checked Ariana's pulse and blood pressure with mechanical precision, her hands moving with practiced indifference. As Mary made her way out of the room, George caught her arm, his gaze steady and intense. "My daughter is suffering. You've ignored her for hours. Don't you care at all?" For a brief moment, something flickered in Mary's eyes, perhaps annoyance or even contempt. "Sir, there are many patients here. I understand you're concerned, but your daughter's case is not as critical as others we're dealing with." George clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to respond with the fury boiling inside him. He wanted to tell her that no other patient had endured this kind of neglect, that he had seen too many people being treated with care and urgency while Ariana was left to languish in pain. But he knew that arguing with Mary would achieve nothing. It would only waste more precious time. Mary left without another word, and George returned to Ariana's side, his heart heavy with despair. He sat beside her, watching her labored breathing, feeling utterly helpless. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here, not to his daughter. Ariana stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open to meet his gaze. "Dad, if I don't make it—" "Don't say that," George interrupted, his voice breaking. "You're going to be fine. I'm going to make sure of it." But Ariana only managed a faint smile, her expression filled with a sadness that pierced him to the core. She closed her eyes again, her body slumping against him as she drifted into a restless, pain-filled sleep. As he held her, George's mind was flooded with memories, moments of laughter, of shared dreams and hopes. He remembered how she had told him just days ago about her plans for the future, her desire to become a doctor so she could help people, so she could make a difference in the world. Now, that future seemed to be slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. In that moment, a fierce determination took hold of him. He would not let Ariana suffer like this without a fight. If the hospital refused to take her seriously, he would make them listen, no matter what it took. As the hours dragged on, George continued to demand answers, refusing to back down, even as the nurses and doctors brushed him aside. He documented every interaction, every dismissive response, determined to hold someone accountable for this nightmare. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sterile walls of the hospital, George felt a dark resolve hardening within him. He would find justice for his daughter. No matter how long it took, no matter how much he had to endure, he would make sure that those responsible for Ariana's suffering would pay. For now, though, all he could do was wait, his heart heavy with a mixture of fear and fury. And as he sat beside Ariana, holding her hand and whispering words of comfort, he prayed that it wouldn't be too late. Ariana's condition had deteriorated to an alarming degree. Her face was almost ghostly pale, and her breathing had become shallow and erratic. George's heart hammered in his chest as he watched her, gripped by a mixture of helplessness and dread. Every breath seemed to be a struggle for her, as though her body were slowly surrendering to the pain that had taken over. He checked the time on his watch repeatedly, each passing minute fueling his mounting frustration and fear. Hours had passed since they'd first arrived, and the memory of Nurse Clayton's dismissive gaze and indifferent words haunted him. George found himself wondering if the hospital's indifference had roots beyond simple overcrowding or protocol, and a dark, uncomfortable thought began to take shape in his mind. Could this neglect be deliberate? The possibility lingered, heavy and unsettling. George had seen subtle, insidious biases throughout his career as a judge, cases where decisions seemed to hinge on a defendant's appearance, background, or perceived status. But he had never expected to encounter such a prejudice here, in a hospital where lives depended on impartial, compassionate care. Ariana's hand clutched his, bringing him back to the present. Her fingers were cold, her grip weaker than before. He squeezed her hand in return, forcing himself to stay calm for her sake. "Dad," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It hurts so much." George's resolve hardened. He leaned closer, brushing a strand of damp hair from her forehead. "I know, sweetheart. I'm going to make sure they take care of you. Just hang on." At that moment, a doctor finally entered the room. He was a tall man with graying hair, his expression strained but professional. George felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the memory of the repeated dismissals they'd already faced. Still, he was determined to remain calm and to advocate for Ariana as best he could. The doctor introduced himself briefly before looking down at Ariana, his brow furrowing as he reviewed her chart. "All right, Miss Jones, I understand you're experiencing abdominal pain and a fever?" Ariana nodded weakly, wincing as another wave of pain coursed through her. George watched the doctor's expression, searching for any sign of empathy, of genuine concern, but his face remained impassive as he examined Ariana's chart, making a few notes without looking at her. "Let's take a look," he said finally, reaching for a blood pressure cuff. George stepped back, allowing the doctor space, but his mind raced with questions. Why hadn't anyone run tests yet? Why had they left her in this condition for so long? He watched, tense and expectant, as the doctor took Ariana's blood pressure and checked her heart rate. The doctor's face remained neutral, his tone professional but detached. After a few minutes, he stepped back, making another note on the chart before addressing George. "I'm going to order some basic tests. A blood test and possibly an ultrasound if the symptoms persist," he said, his tone indicating that he viewed these measures as a formality rather than a necessity. "In the meantime, I'll prescribe some stronger pain medication to help manage her discomfort." George felt a flash of anger. "She's been here for hours already," he said, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "She's clearly in severe pain, and her condition is only getting worse. Why didn't anyone order these tests earlier?" The doctor's expression shifted slightly, a hint of defensiveness flickering in his eyes. "We're doing the best we can, sir," he replied. "There are protocols in place, and we have a high volume of patients to attend to." George clenched his fists, struggling to keep his composure. He knew that arguing further would likely be futile. He had already witnessed how little impact his words seemed to have here, but the sight of Ariana, pale and suffering, filled him with a sense of urgency that overrode his usual restraint. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "she needs more than just pain medication. Can you at least prioritize her tests? She's getting worse." The doctor hesitated, glancing down at Ariana before finally nodding. "I'll see what I can do," he said, though his tone held a note of reluctance. George watched him leave, feeling both relief and frustration. It was progress, but it was too little, too late. He turned back to Ariana, who had closed her eyes, her breathing shallow and labored. He stroked her hand gently, whispering words of reassurance that felt hollow even as he spoke them. Time passed in a blur of anxious waiting, the minutes stretching into hours as they continued to sit in the small, sterile room. George's mind raced with dark thoughts, each one more troubling than the last. What if the delay was due to something beyond simple negligence? What if this was a reflection of the bias he had fought against for so long, now rearing its ugly head in the very place where his daughter's life hung in the balance? He thought back to cases he had presided over, to the families who had come to him seeking justice for loved ones lost to systemic neglect. He had always done his best to be impartial, to uphold the law and protect those who were vulnerable. But now, as he sat here helplessly watching Ariana suffer, he felt the bitter sting of injustice on a deeply personal level. As evening approached, Nurse Clayton returned, her expression as cold and impassive as before. She handed George a clipboard with a form to sign, explaining in clipped tones that the doctor had ordered tests to be conducted within the next hour. George accepted the clipboard, but his patience had worn thin. "What's taken so long?" he demanded, unable to keep the frustration out of his voice. "My daughter's been here all day, and she's only getting worse. Is this how you treat every patient?" Nurse Clayton met his gaze with a look of barely concealed disdain. "We're doing what we can, sir. There are other patients who need attention as well. Not everyone can be seen right away." The implication in her words was unmistakable, and George felt a surge of anger. He wanted to tell her that his daughter was suffering because of their neglect, that her life was at risk because of their indifference. But he knew that arguing with her would only waste more precious time. Instead, he signed the form, his hand trembling with suppressed rage, and handed it back to her. "Just make sure she gets the care she needs," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nurse Clayton gave a curt nod and left the room without another word, leaving George feeling a mixture of frustration and despair. He returned to Ariana's side, his heart heavy as he watched her struggle to breathe, each shallow inhale a painful reminder of how far they had fallen from the system of justice he had once believed in. As the evening wore on, George began to question everything he thought he knew about fairness, about justice. He had dedicated his life to the law, to upholding a system he believed was designed to protect the vulnerable. But here, in this cold, sterile room, he was beginning to realize that the system was not infallible, that it could be twisted and corrupted by those who held power within it. Hours later, as night fell and the hospital grew quiet, a young intern finally entered the room, holding a clipboard and wearing a look of mild concern. George felt a spark of hope, but it was quickly extinguished as the intern informed him that they would need to wait for test results before proceeding with any treatment. The words felt like a death sentence, each syllable cutting through George's resolve like a knife. He wanted to scream, to demand that they do something, anything, to save his daughter. But he knew that his pleas would fall on deaf ears, that the people who held his daughter's life in their hands had already made their decision. As he sat beside Ariana, his hand gripping hers with desperate strength, George made a silent vow. If they lost her, if the people in this hospital allowed his daughter to die because of their neglect, he would ensure that they paid for it. He would bring the full weight of the law down upon them, and he would not rest until justice was served. Ariana stirred, her eyes fluttering open to meet his. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I don't think I can hold on much longer." George's heart broke as he looked into her eyes, filled with pain and fear. He forced himself to smile, to project a strength he didn't feel. "You're going to be okay, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. I won't leave you." Ariana managed a faint smile, her fingers tightening around his. "I know. I just wish they'd take me seriously." The words hung in the air, a bitter reminder of the injustice they were facing. George fought back tears as he held her hand, praying that it wasn't too late, that someone would finally see the suffering his daughter was enduring and take action. But as the hours continued to slip away, his hope grew fainter, replaced by a simmering anger that burned within him like a fire. He would not forget this night. And if the worst came to pass, he would ensure that the people responsible would never forget it either. As night deepened, Ariana's condition spiraled into a state that was nothing short of critical. Her body seemed to burn with fever, her skin covered in a blotchy rash that spoke of a severe infection spreading rapidly through her system. She trembled, her breaths coming in short, gasping pants, each one a struggle that seemed to take her further from consciousness. George sat beside her, his hands clasped together tightly as he watched her with growing dread. He felt helpless, his once firm belief in the power of justice and order unraveling before his eyes. He had always believed in the system he served, in the principles of fairness and accountability. But now he couldn't help but feel betrayed by that very system, a system that seemed willing to let his daughter slip away without so much as an apology or explanation. He had lost count of how many times he had approached the staff, how many times he had asked, begged, even demanded that someone help her. And each time he had been met with the same indifference, the same hollow assurances that someone would attend to her soon. Now, as he looked down at Ariana's pale face, the spark of life fading from her eyes, he knew that soon was a word they could no longer afford. The door opened, and a doctor finally entered the room. Dr. Susan Hayes, her name tag read. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and an air of detachment that made George's stomach twist. She barely looked at him as she moved to Ariana's side, glancing at her chart before finally looking down at the young woman lying on the bed. "I'm Dr. Hayes," she said, her voice professional but devoid of warmth. "I understand you've been experiencing severe pain." Ariana barely managed a nod, her eyes fluttering open briefly to acknowledge the doctor. George could see the hope in her gaze, a desperate, pleading look that cut through him like a knife. He wanted to say something, to force this doctor to take her seriously, but his words caught in his throat. Dr. Hayes performed a cursory examination, checking Ariana's pulse and temperature with clinical precision. Her face remained impassive as she noted the severity of the fever, the blotchy rash spreading across Ariana's skin. "This looks like an advanced infection," Dr. Hayes said, her tone still detached. "We'll need to start her on antibiotics immediately, and I'll order a blood test to determine the exact nature of the infection." George's anger boiled over. He couldn't hold it back any longer. "An infection? It's taken you all day to figure out what's obvious to anyone with eyes? She's been lying here in pain for hours, and you're only now thinking about antibiotics?" Dr. Hayes met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "Sir, we have protocols to follow. This hospital is extremely busy, and we do our best to prioritize cases based on severity." Severity? George's voice shook with barely restrained fury. "My daughter's on the verge of collapse, and you're telling me this isn't severe enough to warrant immediate care?" Dr. Hayes gave him a brief, dispassionate look. "I understand your frustration, but we have to assess each case individually. Now, if you'll allow us to proceed, we'll do everything we can to help her." George wanted to scream, to grab the doctor and shake her out of her complacency, to make her see the horror of what was happening. But he knew that any outburst would only waste more precious time, so he swallowed his rage, focusing instead on Ariana. "Do whatever you have to," he said tightly, his gaze fixed on his daughter. "But you'd better save her." Dr. Hayes ordered the tests, and within minutes a nurse entered the room to draw Ariana's blood. George watched as the nurse handled the process with practiced efficiency, but he couldn't shake the feeling of resentment that had taken root in his chest. Why had it taken so long for them to reach this point? Why had his daughter been left to suffer in silence while others received care and compassion? As he waited for the results, George held Ariana's hand, his mind racing with memories. He thought of the last conversation they'd had just that morning, of her dreams of becoming a doctor and helping those in need. Now, those dreams seemed distant and fragile, slipping through his fingers with each labored breath she took. Ariana stirred, her eyes opening to look at him with a faint smile. "Dad, I'm scared." George's heart ached as he squeezed her hand. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're going to be okay. Just hold on a little longer." But deep down, he wasn't sure he believed his own words. He could feel her slipping away, and every second that passed felt like a cruel reminder of how powerless he was to stop it. The door opened again, and Dr. Hayes returned, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the results. George watched her intently, his fists clenched at his sides, waiting for any sign of hope. "We have a preliminary diagnosis," she said finally, her tone still detached. "It appears to be a bacterial infection, likely sepsis. We'll start her on a broad-spectrum antibiotic, and we'll need to monitor her closely to see how she responds." Sepsis. George's voice was barely a whisper, the word sending a chill down his spine. He knew enough about medicine to understand the gravity of that diagnosis. Sepsis was a life-threatening condition, one that required immediate and intensive treatment. "Yes," Dr. Hayes replied, her tone clinical. "It's a serious infection, but we'll do our best to manage it. With the right treatment, she should improve within a few hours." George felt a surge of anger and despair. All of this could have been avoided if they had taken her symptoms seriously from the start. But now they were facing a battle against time, a race to save his daughter's life that should never have been necessary. As the nurses began administering the antibiotics, George stayed by Ariana's side, his hand never leaving hers. He could see the pain etched into her face, the strain of each breath as she fought against the infection raging within her. He whispered words of encouragement, willing her to hold on, to keep fighting. Hours passed, each one stretching into an eternity as he watched the slow, agonizing progression of her treatment. Ariana's fever showed no signs of breaking, and her breathing remained shallow and labored. George's hope wavered with each passing minute, his faith in the medical team eroding as he saw the toll that their neglect had taken on his daughter. Finally, as dawn broke, casting a pale light over the sterile hospital room, Ariana opened her eyes, her gaze unfocused and distant. George leaned closer, his heart pounding as he searched her face for any sign of improvement, but there was none. Her eyes were filled with a quiet resignation, a look that broke him in a way he hadn't thought possible. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible, I don't think I'm going to make it." George shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't say that, sweetheart. You're strong. You can beat this. Just hold on a little longer." Ariana's hand tightened around his, her gaze filled with a mixture of fear and acceptance. "I tried, Dad. I really did. But I'm so tired." George's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He wanted to tell her that everything would be all right, that she would pull through, but the words wouldn't come. He could see the truth in her eyes, a truth that he had been desperately trying to deny. In those final moments, he felt a profound sense of failure, a crushing weight of guilt and regret. He had always believed in the power of justice, in the idea that the system he served would protect those he loved. But now, as he held his daughter's hand and watched the light fade from her eyes, he realized that the system had betrayed them both. Ariana's breathing slowed, her grip on his hand weakening. She looked up at him one last time, her lips forming a faint, sad smile. "I love you, Dad." George choked back a sob, his voice barely a whisper. "I love you too, Ariana, more than anything." And then, with a final, shuddering breath, she was gone. The room was silent, the only sound the quiet hum of the hospital machines. George sat frozen, his hand still clutching hers as the reality of her death settled over him. A cold, numbing emptiness filled him, a sense of loss so profound that he could barely breathe. In that moment, something within him broke. The man who had once believed in the power of justice, who had devoted his life to upholding the law, felt a dark resolve take hold of him. He would not let Ariana's death be in vain. He would make sure that those responsible for her suffering and neglect would pay for what they had done. As he sat beside his daughter's lifeless body, his heart filled with a cold, unwavering determination. He would find justice for her no matter what it took, and he would not rest until the people who had failed her were held accountable. The grief had yet to fully settle in, and George felt as though he were moving through a thick fog. He moved mechanically, each step, each breath weighed down by the suffocating heaviness of Ariana's absence. The drive home from the hospital was a blur, and when he finally stepped through the door of their house, it felt like he was stepping into another life, one that was shattered, empty, and irrevocably changed. His wife, Denise, had stayed home, waiting for news with Michael, their teenage son. When George entered, Denise rose from the couch, hope glimmering in her eyes before she saw the expression on his face. The words caught in his throat, and he didn't need to speak. The look of despair in his eyes told her everything. Denise's face crumpled, and she sank back down, her hands covering her mouth as sobs racked her body. Michael stood frozen, his gaze shifting from his mother to his father, as if struggling to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. The silence between them was profound, broken only by Denise's quiet sobs and the ticking of the clock, each second marking the beginning of a life they never wanted to imagine. George embraced his wife, holding her tightly, their grief shared yet insurmountable. He had always been the strong one, the pillar of their family. But now, as he held her, he felt hollow, as though something essential had been stripped away, leaving him an empty shell. All he could do was clutch her, absorbing her pain, as if the weight of their collective sorrow might somehow lessen his own. For days, George was barely functional, existing only in fragments. He moved through each day as though in a daze, going through the motions while his mind remained trapped in the hospital room, replaying those final moments with Ariana again and again. The anger, which had simmered quietly beneath the surface in the hospital, now began to grow, intensifying with each memory, each reminder of what they had lost. He had been powerless then, but he vowed that he would not remain powerless now. One evening, as he sat alone in Ariana's room, surrounded by her books, her photos, and all the little things that had once made her so vibrant, George felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He could still see her face in his mind, the way she had looked at him with that faint smile just before she slipped away. That smile, filled with love and resignation, had become a haunting reminder of all that had been taken from them. He couldn't bring her back, but he could bring justice for her. He could ensure that the people responsible for her suffering, for the indifference that had stolen her life, would face the consequences of their actions. George took a deep breath, his heart filled with a dark determination. The wheels of justice would turn, and he would be the one to set them in motion. The next morning, George rose early, dressed in his suit, and gathered his briefcase with a newfound sense of purpose. The grief still lingered, a raw, aching wound that would likely never heal, but he pushed it aside, channeling it into the work ahead. He would bring his legal expertise to bear on this fight, using every resource at his disposal to uncover the truth and hold those responsible accountable. He began by gathering every document, every piece of evidence he could find related to Ariana's treatment at the hospital. He requested her medical records, reading through them carefully, noting every instance of delay, every time a test had been postponed or a treatment ignored. Each line on the chart was a painful reminder of the indifference they had encountered, but it also fueled his determination. With the records in hand, he began reaching out to others who might have experienced similar neglect. He knew that if this had happened to Ariana, there was a strong chance it had happened to others as well. He contacted local advocacy groups, organizations that focused on healthcare discrimination, and social justice networks, asking if they knew of any cases like his daughter's. Through these channels, George began to hear stories, accounts from families who had suffered the same heartbreaking neglect and mistreatment. Some of them shared details that mirrored Ariana's experience: delayed tests, dismissive staff, and a pervasive sense of indifference that had cost them precious time, and, in some cases, the lives of their loved ones. One of the first families George met was the Martins. They had lost their father, a man in his late 50s, who had been admitted to the same hospital with chest pains, only to be sent home with a prescription for antacids. By the time he returned, his condition had worsened, and he died in the emergency room, waiting for a bed that never became available. Sitting in the Martins' modest living room, George listened as Mrs. Martin recounted the story with a quiet, resigned bitterness that echoed his own grief. She described the sense of helplessness, of watching as the medical staff ignored her pleas as her husband grew weaker and weaker. "We thought it was just a fluke, that maybe they were overwhelmed that night," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But hearing your story, Mr. Jones, it makes me think they didn't care at all. Not about him and not about your daughter." George nodded, feeling the weight of her words. This was no isolated incident. It was a pattern, a systemic failure that had cost people their lives, and he was determined to expose it. Over the following weeks, George met with other families, each story adding another layer to the narrative he was building. He documented every detail, every instance of negligence, compiling a dossier that painted a damning picture of the hospital's practices. He knew that if he was going to take this to court, he would need to build an airtight case, one that could withstand the scrutiny of the legal system. One evening, as he was going over his notes, George received an unexpected call. It was from a young man named Samuel Reed, a hospital intern who had heard about Ariana's case through one of the advocacy groups George had contacted. Samuel sounded nervous, his voice barely a whisper over the phone. I saw what happened with your daughter, Mr. Jones," Samuel said, his voice trembling. "I was there that night, and I have something you should see." George's heart raced. "What do you mean, Samuel? What do you have?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Samuel spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I recorded some things, conversations, things I thought were wrong. I didn't know what to do with them, but I think you should have them." They arranged to meet in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, a place where they could talk without attracting attention. George arrived early, scanning the room for any sign of Samuel. When the young man finally entered, he looked around nervously before spotting George and making his way over. Samuel slid into the booth across from George, his hands trembling as he pulled a small flash drive from his pocket. "This has recordings of conversations between some of the nurses and doctors," he said, his voice barely audible. They talked about cases like your daughter's. They joked about it, like it was just another inconvenience." George's stomach churned as he accepted the flash drive, his mind racing. He thanked Samuel, offering him assurances that he would be protected as a whistleblower. Samuel nodded, relief evident on his face as he left the cafe, disappearing into the night. When George returned home, he plugged the flash drive into his laptop, his hands shaken as he listened to the recordings. The voices were clear, unmistakable. The voices of medical professionals discussing patients with a shocking lack of empathy, mocking those who overreacted to symptoms and dismissing cases that they deemed not worth the effort. The recordings were damning, a chilling confirmation of what George had suspected all along. The indifference, the lack of care, it wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, systemic failure, one that had cost Ariana her life. Armed with this new evidence, George knew that the time had come to take his fight public. He reached out to several journalists, sharing Ariana's story along with the evidence he had gathered. The news spread quickly, sparking outrage and calls for justice as people across the community began to rally behind him. Protests were organized outside the hospital, and the media descended upon the institution, demanding answers. George gave interviews, sharing the painful details of Ariana's final hours, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury that resonated with viewers. His determination became a rallying cry, a call for accountability that could no longer be ignored. As the hospital faced mounting pressure, George prepared for the legal battle ahead. He knew that the road would be long and difficult, that the hospital would fight back with every resource at their disposal. But he was undeterred. He had already lost the most precious thing in his life, and there was nothing left to fear. This fight was no longer just for Ariana. It was for every family that had suffered, every patient who had been treated as an inconvenience rather than a human being. George would bring them justice, no matter what it took. With his evidence compiled and his case stronger than ever, George took the first steps toward filing a formal lawsuit against the hospital, knowing that the journey he had begun was far from over. But he would see it through, for Ariana's sake and for the countless others who deserved a voice. And as he stood outside the courthouse, the weight of his grief momentarily lifted by the resolve in his heart, George knew that he was ready for whatever lay ahead. The courtroom was silent, filled with the tense anticipation that often preceded a high-profile case. Journalists packed the benches at the back of the room, their cameras and notebooks poised to capture every word, every gesture. Members of the community had shown up in support of George Jones, drawn by the media coverage of his relentless fight for justice for his daughter, Ariana. The hospital's defense team, a lineup of expensive lawyers in tailored suits, sat at one table, their expressions impassive. Across from them sat George, a figure of quiet determination, flanked by his legal team and holding tightly to his conviction that the truth would finally be heard. As the judge entered the room, everyone rose, the solemnity of the moment casting a heavy silence over the crowd. George felt his pulse quicken, his mind focused on the fight ahead. This was the moment he had prepared for, the culmination of weeks of investigation, late nights poring over documents, and the grief he had transformed into a mission for justice. The judge called the court to order, and the opening statements began. George's attorney, a seasoned advocate named Clara Ruiz, approached the jury, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Clara began, her gaze moving across the faces of each juror. "Today, you will hear the story of a young woman who came to this hospital seeking help and was instead met with negligence and indifference. Ariana Jones was a promising young woman with a bright future, but because of the failures of those entrusted with her care, her life was cut short. This case is about more than just one life. It's about a system that has allowed this kind of negligence to persist, a system that values protocols and profits over the very lives it is meant to protect." The jury listened attentively, and George could see a glimmer of empathy in their faces. Clara's words resonated with them, striking at the heart of what this case was truly about. George took a deep breath, steadying himself as the defense prepared their counter-arguments. The defense attorney, a polished man named Richard Fenton, rose to deliver his opening statement, his tone calm and measured. "This is undoubtedly a tragic situation, and we sympathize deeply with Mr. Jones and his family. However, we contend that the hospital staff did everything within their power to care for Miss Jones according to established protocols. There were no malicious intentions, no negligence, only a commitment to following procedures in a challenging and overcrowded healthcare system." George felt a surge of anger as he listened to Fenton's words. The defense was attempting to reduce Ariana's suffering to a matter of protocol, as though her death were a mere oversight in an otherwise efficient system. But he knew the truth, and he was determined to ensure that the jury saw it as well. The trial proceeded with a series of witnesses, each one shedding light on the hospital's practices and the events leading up to Ariana's death. First to testify was Samuel Reed, the young intern who had provided George with the damning recordings of the hospital staff. Samuel looked nervous as he took the stand, his eyes darting around the room before finally settling on George. "Mr. Reed," Clara began, her voice gentle but firm, "can you tell us what you witnessed on the night Ariana Jones was admitted to the hospital?" Samuel cleared his throat, glancing briefly at the defense team before answering. I saw that the staff didn't treat her case as urgent. They talked about her like she was exaggerating her symptoms. Some of the nurses, including Nurse Clayton, even made jokes about her, saying things like, 'Here comes another drama queen.'" His voice wavered, but he pressed on. I felt uncomfortable with the way they spoke about her, so I recorded some of their conversations." Clara nodded, her expression supportive. "And did you ever feel that this attitude of dismissal or indifference extended to other patients as well?" Samuel hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. There were several cases where patients who didn't look serious enough were left waiting, even if they were clearly in pain." Clara introduced the recordings into evidence, playing them for the court. The voices of the hospital staff filled the room, their dismissive laughter and casual remarks about overreacting patients echoing in the tense silence. The jury shifted uncomfortably, their expressions a mixture of shock and dismay. George watched their reactions, feeling a small glimmer of hope. they were beginning to see the truth. The defense attempted to downplay Samuel's testimony, arguing that he was a young, inexperienced intern who might have misunderstood the protocols or taken remarks out of context. But the recordings were hard to ignore, and George could see that the jury's initial sympathy for the hospital was starting to waver. Next, Clara called several families who had suffered similar experiences at the hospital. Mrs. Martin took the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she recounted the story of her husband's death. Her voice was soft but steady, each word heavy with the weight of loss. "My husband. He was in pain, and I begged them to help him," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "But they kept telling me he'd be fine, that there were others who needed attention more urgently. By the time they finally saw him, it was too late. He died in that waiting room just feet away from the help he needed." Her words struck a chord with the jury, and George felt a renewed sense of determination. This was not just about Ariana. It was about a pattern of neglect, a culture of indifference that had stolen lives and shattered families. One by one, the other families shared their stories, each one painting a damning picture of the hospital's practices. The defense tried to discredit them, arguing that each case was an isolated incident, that no single patient's experience could speak to the overall quality of care. But the cumulative effect of their testimonies was undeniable. It became clear that this was not an isolated incident, but a systemic failure. When it was the defense's turn to call witnesses, they brought in senior hospital staff, including Nurse Clayton and Dr. Hayes. Nurse Clayton took the stand with a look of steely defiance, her gaze cold as she recounted her version of events. "I did my job to the best of my ability," she said, her tone defensive. "We were understaffed that night, and there were patients with life-threatening conditions who needed immediate attention. Miss Jones was in pain, but she was stable. Protocol dictated that we prioritize other cases." Clara's cross-examination was precise and unyielding. "Miss Clayton, would you say that your comments about Miss Jones being a drama queen were professional? Do you believe that dismissing a patient's pain because they appear stable is in line with your duty of care?" Nurse Clayton shifted uncomfortably, but her defiance didn't waver. "We're human beings, not machines. We do our best under difficult circumstances. I may have made some comments in frustration, but it didn't affect the level of care I provided." Clara pressed further, highlighting the recorded conversations, the laughter, the dismissive tone. The jury listened, their expressions growing harder with each response. They could see through the defense's attempts to paint the negligence as mere human error in an overworked system. Dr. Hayes took the stand next, her tone polished but equally detached. She spoke about the challenges of hospital management, the protocols designed to optimize care, and the limitations imposed by resource shortages. But Clara's questions cut through her polished responses, forcing her to confront the reality of Ariana's case and the blatant disregard that had cost a young woman her life. Finally, it was George's turn to testify. As he took the stand, he felt the weight of Ariana's memory pressing down on him, filling him with both sorrow and strength. He looked out at the jury, seeing their sympathetic gazes, and took a deep breath. "My daughter, Ariana, was a bright young woman," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "She had dreams, ambitions, a future that was taken from her by the very people who were supposed to protect her. She came to that hospital seeking help, but instead she was met with indifference, with people who saw her as an inconvenience rather than a life worth saving." He recounted the events of that night, the hours spent waiting, the dismissive remarks, the gut-wrenching realization that his daughter was slipping away. His words were raw, unfiltered, filled with the pain of a father who had lost everything. The courtroom was silent, the jury captivated by his testimony. George could see the impact his words had on them, the way they leaned forward, their faces etched with empathy and horror. "I'm here today not just for Ariana," he concluded, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm here for every family that has suffered because of this hospital's neglect, for every person who was dismissed, ignored, treated as though their pain didn't matter. My daughter deserved better. They all did." In her closing argument, Clara painted a vivid picture of the systemic failure that had led to Ariana's death. She reminded the jury of the recordings, the testimonies, the countless lives affected by the hospital's negligence. She urged them to see this case not just as an isolated incident, but as a call to action, a chance to hold those in power accountable. The defense attempted to sway the jury with claims of protocol adherence, logistical challenges, and human error. But the jury's faces remained impassive, their minds already made up. When the jury returned with the verdict, George held his breath, his heart pounding as the foreman stood to announce their decision. On the charge of negligence resulting in wrongful death, we find the defendants guilty. A wave of relief washed over George, mingling with the sorrow that still weighed heavily on his heart. Justice had been served, but it was a hollow victory. Nothing could bring Ariana back. Nothing could fill the void her absence had left. But he had kept his promise to her. He had fought for her memory, and for all those who had suffered in silence. As he left the courtroom, surrounded by reporters and supporters, George felt a strange sense of peace. His fight was over, but Ariana's legacy would live on, a reminder to the world that every life mattered, that every voice deserved to be heard. He glanced up at the sky, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "I did it, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice filled with both sorrow and pride. "I kept my promise." Thank you for watching the story to the end. Subscribe so you don't miss new videos, and hit the bell for notifications. We have many more stories you'll definitely want to see. Go to the next videos and stay tuned. There are more stories to come.